She did not scream. She did not collapse onto the floor. She did not call anyone, or reach for her phone, or do any of the things you might expect from a woman whose body had finally decided it was done. She simply sat on the edge of her bed on a Tuesday morning, in November, fully dressed, shoes laced up, her badge clipped to her scrubs exactly where it always was, and she could not move. Not because something was physically wrong with her legs, not because she was sick with a fever or dizzy from skipping breakfast. She simply sat there, staring at the carpet, and the distance between sitting and standing felt like something she no longer had the equipment to cross. Her name was Carol Merritt. She was 54 years old. She had been a registered nurse at Vanderbilt University Medical Center in Nashville, Tennessee for 22 years. She had shown up through hurricanes and holidays and a divorce that quietly dismantled the life she had spent a decade building. She had shown up when her mother was in hospice and she herself was barely holding a coherent thought together. She had shown up the morning after her youngest daughter left for college, and the house felt so empty it echoed. In 9 years, Carol Merritt had not called in sick once. Not once. And on that Tuesday morning in November, fully dressed, badge clipped, shoes laced, she sat on the edge of her bed and could not stand up. The question that most people would ask in that moment is the wrong one. Most people would look at Carol Merritt and ask whether she was tired, whether she needed more sleep, whether she had been eating well or drinking enough water or taking her vitamins. And those are not unreasonable questions, but they are surface questions. They are the kind of questions that treat a flooded basement by mopping the floor, without ever asking why the pipes burst. The real question, the one that Carol herself would not be able to answer for another 4 months, was not about sleep or diet or hydration. It was about what happens to a human nervous system when it is asked to perform at full capacity, without pause, without genuine recovery, for years at a time. It was about what happens when a person who has spent a lifetime being strong for everyone else finally runs out of the one resource that no one warned her was not unlimited. And here is what the science now tells us, clearly and without ambiguity, that most of us were never taught in school, never told by our doctors, and never saw reflected in a culture that has always rewarded the people who push through over the people who pause. What Carol experienced on that Tuesday morning was not weakness. It was not laziness. It was not a character flaw or a sign of fragility or evidence that she was not built for the life she had chosen. It was burnout. Clinical, measurable, physiological burnout. And it had been building inside her body long before she ever sat down on that bed and could not get back up. Before we go any further, let us know in the comments where you are watching from. We would love to hear from you. And do not forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. By the end of what you are about to hear, you will never use the word lazy the same way again. Because what happened to Carol Merritt is happening right now to millions of people across this country. People who are dressed and ready and trying with everything they have and simply cannot move. And most of them have no idea why. To understand what was happening inside Carol Merritt on that November morning, you have to understand something about the way the human body manages stress. Because almost everything most people believe about it is incomplete. We tend to think of stress as a mental experience, something that happens in the mind, something you can talk yourself out of, or sleep off, or push past with enough willpower and the right attitude. And that belief, that deeply American, deeply cultural belief, that the strong person is the one who keeps going, is precisely what makes burnout so dangerous. Because burnout does not care how strong you are. In fact, the research suggests it disproportionately targets the strongest people, the ones who never say no, the ones who add one more thing to an already impossible list and find a way to get it done, the ones who, when asked how they are doing, always say fine. Carol Merritt had been saying fine for 3 years. She said it to her daughters, she said it to her colleagues, she said it to her own reflection in the bathroom mirror on the mornings when she had to stand there for an extra minute before she could make her face do what faces are supposed to do. Fine. Always fine. Right up until the morning she was not. The term burnout was first formally introduced into psychological literature in 1974 by a psychologist named Herbert Freudenberger, who noticed something troubling happening among the staff at a free clinic in New York City where he worked. The most dedicated, most passionate, most committed workers, the ones who had come to the clinic not for a paycheck, but because they genuinely believed in the mission, were the ones who deteriorated fastest. They came in early, They stayed late. They gave everything they had. And then, over months and years, something in them quietly extinguished. Freudenberger described it as looking like a building that had burned from the inside out. The outside walls were still standing. From a distance, everything looked intact. But step inside and there was nothing left. No heat, no light, just the hollow shell of something that had once burned very brightly. That image, a building gutted from within, is the most accurate description of what Carol Merritt looked like to the people who knew her in the months before that Tuesday morning. From the outside, she was still Carol, still showing up, still doing the work. But something essential inside her had gone very, very quiet. What you are about to hear is not just Carol's story. It is the story of an estimated 77% of workers in the United States who report experiencing burnout at their current job, according to a survey by Deloitte. It is the story of the parent who cannot explain why they feel nothing at their child's school play. The retiree who spent 40 years dreaming of rest and now finds that rest brings no relief. The caregiver who has poured so much of themselves into another person's survival that they have forgotten what it feels like to want something for themselves. Burnout does not discriminate by profession or income or age. But it does have a particular appetite for people over 45 who have spent decades in roles defined by responsibility. To families, to careers, to communities, without ever being taught that the engine powering all of that responsibility has limits. Carol Merritt was all of those things. And on that Tuesday morning, the engine stopped. There are 6 signs that the body and mind are not lazy, not weak, not falling apart, but burning out. 6 signs that are so commonly misread, so frequently dismissed, so thoroughly confused with personal failure, that most people who experience them spend months or years blaming themselves before anyone gives them the language to understand what is actually happening. Carol experienced all 6. She experienced them in sequence, like chapters in a book she did not know she was reading, each one building on the last, each one a little louder than the one before, right up until the final chapter, when her body delivered its verdict on that November morning, in the only way it had left. We are going to walk through each of those signs. We are going to follow Carol through every one of them. And by the time we are done, you will not just understand burnout intellectually, you will recognize it. In someone you love, or in yourself. The first sign is one that almost everyone who has ever experienced burnout describes first, and almost everyone around them dismisses first. It is the sign that gets repackaged as laziness more often than any other. It is the experience of waking up exhausted, not groggy, not slow to start. Exhausted, the same bone-deep, behind the eyes, everything is heavy exhaustion that Carol Merritt felt when she went to sleep. Still present and unchanged when she opened her eyes 8 hours later. For most people, sleep is the system reset. You go in depleted and you come out restored. That is how it is supposed to work. That is the biological contract. But for someone in the advanced stages of burnout, that contract has been broken. And the reason it breaks comes down to something happening deep inside the body's stress response system, specifically inside what scientists call the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis. This is the system responsible for regulating cortisol, the body's primary stress hormone. Under normal circumstances, cortisol follows a predictable rhythm. It rises in the morning to wake you up and give you energy, then gradually decreases throughout the day, dropping to its lowest point at night, so that sleep can do its restorative work. But when a person has been under sustained, chronic stress for months or years, the kind of low-grade, relentless, never fully resolving stress that Carol had been living inside without naming it, that rhythm breaks down. Cortisol stops following the pattern. It stays elevated at night, when it should be low, flooding the brain and body with a chemical signal that says, alert, prepare, do not rest. And the result is a sleep that looks like sleep from the outside, but functions nothing like it on the inside. Carol had been sleeping 7 to 8 hours a night for most of her adult life. She was not the kind of person who stayed up late scrolling her phone or sacrificed sleep for television. She was disciplined about it. And yet for the 2 years leading up to that November morning, she had been waking up every single day feeling as though she had not slept at all. She mentioned it to a colleague once, who laughed and said, "Welcome to your 50s." She mentioned it to her doctor at an annual checkup, who ordered blood work, found nothing alarming, and suggested she try melatonin. She tried the melatonin. It did not help. Because the problem was never in the melatonin. The problem was in a nervous system that had been running on emergency power for so long that it had forgotten how to power down. A 2021 study published in the journal Psychoneuroendocrinology found that individuals with clinical burnout showed measurably dysregulated cortisol patterns compared to non-burnout controls, patterns that directly interfered with sleep quality regardless of sleep duration. Carol was not tired because she was weak. Carol was tired because her body's internal chemistry had been quietly rewritten by years of unrelenting demand, and nobody had told her that was even possible. The second sign is subtler than the first, and in some ways more frightening, because it strikes at the very thing that most high-functioning people use to define their competence and their worth. It is the experience of small tasks becoming impossible. Not difficult, not inconvenient, impossible. The kind of impossible where you stand in the kitchen staring at a grocery list written in your own handwriting and cannot make your brain decide whether to buy the chicken or the pasta first. Where you sit down to answer 3 emails and 40 minutes later realize you have been staring at the screen without typing a single word. Where the decisions that used to be automatic, what to wear, what to eat, what to do next, suddenly require an effort that feels wildly out of proportion to their actual size. Carol first noticed this about 18 months before the Tuesday morning. She had been filling out a routine patient intake form, something she had done hundreds of times, something that required almost no cognitive effort, and she had stopped 3 times in the middle of it, unable to remember what she had already written. She had looked at the form and felt something she did not have a name for yet. Not confusion exactly, more like the feeling of reaching for something on a shelf that has always been there and finding the shelf empty. What Carol was experiencing has a neurological explanation that is as concrete and measurable as a broken bone, even though it leaves no visible mark. The prefrontal cortex, the region of the brain responsible for executive function, decision-making, working memory, and cognitive flexibility, is exquisitely sensitive to cortisol. Under short-term stress, cortisol actually sharpens prefrontal function. That is why people sometimes perform well under pressure, but under prolonged, chronic stress, the kind that does not resolve, the kind that is just the permanent background frequency of a life lived at full capacity for too long, cortisol becomes toxic to prefrontal tissue. Research published in the journal Neuron has shown that chronic stress causes measurable structural changes in the prefrontal cortex, reducing the density of synaptic connections and literally shrinking the region that handles complex thought. What Carol experienced as forgetting how to fill out a form she had filled out 100 times was not cognitive decline. It was not early dementia, which her mind had already gone to in her darkest moments. It was a brain that had been saturated in stress hormones for so long that its highest-order functions had begun to contract. She was not losing her mind. She was losing access to it. Temporarily, reversibly, but terrifyingly, because nobody had ever told her that this was something burnout could do. The third sign is the one that most people feel the deepest shame about. It is the one they are least likely to admit to a doctor or a friend or even themselves, because it carries with it a particular kind of grief that is hard to name and harder to explain. It is the experience of feeling nothing toward the things that used to mean everything. Carol Merritt had loved nursing with the kind of love that most people reserve for family. She had chosen it at 22 not because it was practical, though it was, and not because it paid well, though it eventually did, but because she had sat with her grandmother in a hospital room at 17 years old and watched a nurse do something that stopped her in her tracks. The nurse had not done anything medical. She had simply pulled a chair close to the bed, taken her grandmother's hand, and talked to her. Not at her, not about her, like she was a whole person and not a patient. Carol had decided in that moment that that was what she wanted to do with her life. And for more than 2 decades, she had done it. She had held hands through diagnoses. She had sat with families in waiting rooms. She had been present for the best and worst moments of strangers' lives in the way that very few professions allow, and she had never once taken that for granted. Until she did. Until she could not feel it anymore. The technical term for what Carol was experiencing is depersonalization, one of the 3 core dimensions of burnout as defined by psychologist Christina Maslach, whose work at the University of California, Berkeley, became the foundation for how burnout is clinically understood and measured today. Maslach identified depersonalization as the development of a detached, cynical, or even callous response to the people and activities that a person was once genuinely invested in. It is the mind's defensive response to a system that has been overwhelmed for too long. When the emotional resources required to be present, truly present, in the way that Carol's grandmother's nurse had been present, are depleted beyond a certain threshold, the brain begins rationing what is left. It begins creating distance where there was once closeness. It substitutes numbness for feeling, not out of indifference, but out of a kind of neurological self-preservation. Carol did not stop caring about her patients because she had become a bad nurse. She stopped feeling it because the system that generates feeling had been running on empty for years, and the brain had quietly redirected those resources toward basic survival functions instead. She knew this intellectually, eventually. But in the months before she knew anything, she sat in the break room after particularly difficult shifts and felt the absence of what she used to feel, and told herself that maybe she had never been as good as she thought, that maybe she had always been this hollow and had simply not noticed. She also stopped caring about things at home. Her garden, a small patch of raised beds along the back fence where she had grown tomatoes, peppers, and herbs every summer for 11 years, went unplanted the spring before the Tuesday morning. She walked past it every day without stopping. She had once loved Sunday mornings in that garden, the way some people love church. The smell of the soil, the particular quiet of early morning in the backyard before Nashville woke up. She had photographs from every season for 11 years. The seedlings, the first tomatoes, the harvest. That spring she walked past the empty beds and felt nothing. Not sadness, not even the awareness of absence. Just nothing. And in some ways, the nothing was harder to live with than sadness would have been. Because sadness at least tells you that something mattered. Nothing just sits there, quiet and heavy and without explanation. The fourth sign tends to arrive in the company of confusion and guilt, because it looks on the surface like something it is not. It looks like a short temper. It looks like impatience. It looks like the kind of irritability that people associate with someone who is difficult to be around, someone who has not learned to manage their emotions, someone who needs to take a breath and get it together. Carol's younger daughter, Jenna, noticed it first. She called her mother one evening to tell her about a job offer she was considering, something she was excited about, something she wanted to talk through. And Carol snapped at her within the first 3 minutes over something so small that Carol could not even remember what it was an hour later. Jenna went quiet on the phone. Carol apologized immediately, genuinely, and felt so terrible about it afterward that she cried alone in her kitchen for 20 minutes. That was the part nobody saw. The crying after, the shame that came in the wake of every moment she did not recognize herself, the private, exhausting work of trying to hold together a version of herself that was becoming increasingly difficult to locate. What Carol was experiencing in those moments, and what the research on burnout consistently identifies as one of its most misunderstood symptoms, is emotional dysregulation. The ability to manage emotional responses, to maintain proportionality between a stimulus and a reaction, is a function of the prefrontal cortex working in coordination with the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center. Under normal circumstances, the prefrontal cortex acts as a kind of governor on the amygdala. It receives the emotional signal, processes it, and modulates the response so that it is appropriate to the situation. But when the prefrontal cortex is compromised by chronic cortisol exposure, that governing function weakens. The amygdala fires at full intensity, and the brake system that should temper the response is no longer reliable. The result is reactions that feel, to the person experiencing them, completely out of their control. Because neurologically, they increasingly are. Carol was not becoming a different person. She was becoming a person whose brain was no longer able to do consistently what it had always done automatically. And the cruelest part of it was that she was aware enough to feel the shame of each misfired moment, but not yet informed enough to understand why it kept happening. The fifth sign is the one that Carol's doctor almost missed. It is the one that tends to get treated in isolation, addressed symptom by symptom, without anyone stepping back far enough to see the larger pattern. It is the sign that the body has begun communicating what the mind will not, or cannot, say out loud. For Carol, it started with headaches. Not the occasional tension headache that responds to ibuprofen and a glass of water. Persistent headaches present most mornings, that dulled but never fully left. Then came the chest tightness, not painful enough to send her to the emergency room but present enough that she was aware of it. A low-grade pressure that sat behind her sternum through most of her shifts. Then the infections. 3 separate respiratory infections in a 4-month period, which for someone who had worked in a hospital for 2 decades and had an immune system well practiced in defending against pathogens, was as clear a signal as any that something systemic was wrong. Her colleagues joked that she needed to take her own medical advice and rest. She laughed with them. She went home and Googled her symptoms in the dark after her daughters were asleep, cycling through possibilities, landing on nothing that fit the whole picture. The American Institute of Stress has published extensive research on the physical consequences of chronic stress and burnout, and what it describes is a body under sustained physiological siege. When the stress response remains activated over long periods, when cortisol and adrenaline continue circulating at levels designed for short-term emergencies rather than long-term daily life, the immune system pays a measurable price. Specifically, sustained cortisol elevation suppresses the production and activity of lymphocytes, the white blood cells responsible for identifying and neutralizing pathogens. The body, in its effort to keep the stress response fueled and ready, essentially borrows resources from the immune system and never fully pays them back. Carol was not getting sick because she worked in a hospital. She had worked in a hospital for 22 years without this pattern. She was getting sick because her immune system was operating at reduced capacity, not because of a disease or a deficiency, but because her body had been quietly redistributing its resources for years to sustain a level of output that was never meant to be permanent. The headaches, the chest pressure, the infections, these were not separate problems. They were the same problem, wearing different faces, trying in every language available to a human body to tell Carol Merritt what she could not yet bring herself to say in words. The 6th sign is the one that closes the trap. It is the sign that takes everything that came before it, the exhaustion that sleep cannot touch, the cognitive fog, the emotional numbness, the misplaced anger, the body that keeps breaking down, and adds to it the one thing that makes recovery feel truly impossible. It is the loss of belief that rest will help. By the time Carol reached this 6th sign, she had been living inside the first 5 for long enough that she had developed a relationship with them. They were familiar. They were terrible and exhausting and disorienting, but they were known. What the 6th sign brought was something she had not experienced before, something that frightened her in a way none of the others had, because the others had felt like problems she might eventually solve. The 6th sign felt like the removal of the solution. She took a Saturday off, genuinely off. No errands, no obligations, her phone set to Do Not Disturb. She sat in her living room with a cup of coffee and a book she had been meaning to read for 2 months, and she felt nothing, not peaceful, not rested, not even bored in the regenerative way that boredom can sometimes be. She felt guilty, restless, like she was doing something wrong by not doing something. She put the book down after 40 minutes and found things to clean that did not need cleaning, and by Sunday evening she felt more depleted than she had on Friday. Rest had stopped working. And more frightening than that, she had stopped believing it ever would. Psychologists who study burnout recovery describe this 6th sign as one of the most clinically significant markers of severe burnout, because it represents a disruption not just of the body's ability to rest, but of the nervous system's capacity to recognize safety. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, whose research on trauma and the nervous system has reshaped how we understand chronic stress responses, has written extensively about the way a nervous system that has been in sustained threat mode can lose the ability to down-regulate, to shift from high alert into the parasympathetic state that genuine rest requires. The nervous system, after enough time in emergency mode, begins to experience stillness not as safety, but as a gap in vigilance, a vulnerability. And it responds to that perceived vulnerability by generating restlessness, guilt, anxiety, anything that will move the body back into action. Carol was not unable to rest because she was a workaholic, or because she did not value her own well-being. She was unable to rest because her nervous system had been in survival mode for so long that it had reclassified rest as a threat. And no amount of Saturday mornings with coffee and books was going to fix that, without someone first helping her understand what had happened to her and why. The Tuesday morning came in the way that final mornings always do, without announcement, without any particular indication that it was going to be different from the ones before it. Carol's alarm went off at 5:45. She got up, showered, made coffee, got dressed, clipped her badge to her scrubs. She did everything in the correct order, in the correct way, the way she had done it for 9 years without variation. She picked up her keys from the hook by the door. She walked back to the bedroom to get her phone from the charger, and then she sat on the edge of the bed to put on her shoes. She laced the first one, she reached for the second one, and something stopped. Not in her legs, not in her hands. Something in the center of her, somewhere between her chest and her stomach, stopped in a way she had no words for, and no frame of reference to understand. She sat there, the second shoe in her hands, the clock on the nightstand reading 6:12, and she could not stand up. She sat there for 23 minutes. She knows the exact number, because she watched the clock the entire time, waiting for the thing that had stopped to start again. At 6:35, she set the shoe down on the floor. She picked up her phone, and for the first time in 9 years, she called in sick. She did not know what to tell them. When the charge nurse answered, Carol said she was not feeling well, which was true, in the way that saying the ocean is wet is technically accurate, but entirely insufficient to describe its depth. She hung up the phone and lay back on the bed, still fully dressed, badge still clipped, one shoe on and one shoe off, and stared at the ceiling. She was not crying. She had gone past crying some time ago. She just lay there, and the ceiling looked back at her, and neither of them had anything useful to say. Her daughters did not know. Her colleagues did not know. Her doctor, who had seen her twice in the past year for symptoms that together told a clear story and separately told nothing, did not know. Carol Merritt, who had spent 22 years knowing what was wrong with other people and what to do about it, did not know. She knew only that something had ended. She did not know yet that something else, something necessary and long overdue, was about to begin. It was her colleague and closest friend at the hospital, a nurse named Diane Holloway, who finally said the word. Diane had noticed the headaches, the flatness, the 3 respiratory infections, the way Carol's laugh had become slightly delayed, like she was watching herself from a short distance and doing her best to keep up appearances but always arriving just a beat behind where she used to be. They had worked together for 14 years. Diane knew the difference between Carol having a hard week and Carol losing something she did not know how to name. She came over on a Thursday evening with takeout from the Thai place on Charlotte Avenue that they had been going to together since 2015. They sat at Carol's kitchen table and Diane, without preamble, without softening it into a question, said, "Carol, I think you're burnt out. Not tired, not stressed. Burnt out. And I think you need to talk to someone." Carol's first response was to laugh. Her second response, which arrived almost immediately behind the first, was to start crying in a way she had not cried since her mother's funeral. Not because Diane had said something devastating, but because she had said something true. And the truth, when it finally arrives after a long absence, does not always feel like relief. Sometimes it feels like a door swinging open in a room you had sealed shut because you were afraid of what was inside it. Carol made an appointment with her primary care physician the following week. She had been rehearsing what she would say, keeping it clinical, keeping it contained, presenting her symptoms in the organized, precise way that healthcare professionals present information, because it feels safer than presenting themselves. But when Dr. Patricia Wells walked in and asked how she was doing, Carol looked at her and said, "I don't know." 2 words. The most honest 2 words she had spoken in possibly 3 years. Dr. Wells pulled her chair close to the exam table. The same instinct, Carol would think later, that had made her want to be a nurse at 17 years old, and asked Carol to tell her everything she had been experiencing. Not just the headaches and the infections. Everything. Carol talked for 20 minutes. She had not talked for 20 minutes straight about herself in longer than she could remember. When she finished, Dr. Wells sat with what Carol had said for a moment before she spoke. And then she said something that Carol would later describe as the sentence that changed the trajectory of the next year of her life. She said, "Carol, your nervous system has been in emergency mode for so long that it has forgotten how to come down. This is not weakness. This is not aging. This is burnout, and it is one of the most treatable conditions I see in this office, and one of the most commonly misdiagnosed as a personal failing." What Dr. Wells outlined for Carol in that appointment was not a prescription or a referral to a specialist, though both of those things came later. What she outlined first was an understanding, a framework for making sense of the past 3 years that did not involve Carol being insufficient, or fragile, or wrong. She explained the HPA axis and the cortisol dysregulation. She explained the prefrontal cortex changes and why decision-making had become so effortful. She explained depersonalization as a neurological defense mechanism, not a sign of moral failure. She explained why Carol's immune system had been compromised, and why rest had stopped feeling restful. She explained all 6 things that Carol had been living inside without a map, and she named them not as symptoms of weakness, but as the predictable, documented, measurable consequences of a nervous system that had been asked to do too much for too long without adequate support or recovery. Carol sat on that exam table and felt something she had not felt in years. She felt understood, not fixed, not better, just seen, accurately and completely seen, by someone who had the language for what Carol had been unable to name. It was, she would say later, the first time in 3 years that she had not felt entirely alone inside her own life. The recovery was not fast. Carol would be the first person to tell you that anyone who promises you a fast recovery from burnout is selling you something. The nervous system does not reset in a weekend retreat or a 2-week vacation or a series of breathing exercises, though all of those things have their place. The nervous system resets slowly, over months, through a sustained reduction in demand combined with a sustained increase in genuine recovery. The kind of recovery that is not guilty and not conditional and not squeezed into the margins of a life that is otherwise unchanged. Carol took a medical leave for 6 weeks. 6 weeks during which she did not set an alarm, did not check her work email, did not volunteer for anything or take on any obligations that were not genuinely chosen. The first 2 weeks she slept 12 hours a night and still felt exhausted when she woke up, which Dr. Wells had told her to expect. The 3rd week she started taking walks, short ones, not for exercise but for the sensation of moving through the world at a pace that had nothing to do with efficiency. The 4th week she bought seeds for the garden. She did not plant them immediately. She just bought them and put them on the kitchen table and looked at them in the morning, while she drank her coffee. The 5th week she planted them. She stood in the backyard in the early morning quiet, her hands in the soil, and for the first time in longer than she could accurately remember, she felt something. Not happiness exactly, something quieter than happiness but more sustainable. Something that felt, tentatively and carefully, like herself. She returned to work after the 6 weeks, but she returned differently. She and Dr. Wells had spent part of the leave sessions working with a therapist who specialized in burnout recovery, a woman named Dr. Sandra Okafor, whose practice on West End Avenue had a waiting list 6 months long because burnout, it turned out, had not waited for Carol Merritt to discover it before finding the rest of Nashville. In therapy, Carol did something she had never done in 54 years of living. She learned to identify what she needed before she reached the point of emergency. She learned that the signals her body had been sending for 3 years before the Tuesday morning were not new. They had always been there. She had simply been too busy, too committed, too thoroughly convinced that her job was to take care of everyone else, to notice that she was also, somewhere under all of it, a person who needed taking care of. She learned to say no, not easily, not without discomfort, but with the understanding that every no to the wrong thing was a yes to the capacity she needed to do the right things well. She learned that rest was not a reward she earned by being productive enough. It was a biological requirement, without which productivity, and eventually everything else, would fail. She also had a conversation with Jenna that she had been postponing for months. She sat her daughter down and told her what had happened. Not the sanitized version, not the version where everything was fine and Mom had just been a little tired. The real version. She told her about the Tuesday morning. She told her about the shoe and the clock and the 23 minutes. She told her about the garden going unplanted and the patients she had stopped feeling connected to, and the phone calls she had not returned, and the private crying after every misfired moment of irritability. Jenna sat across from her mother and did not say anything for a long time. Then she said, "Mom, why didn't you tell me?" And Carol looked at her daughter, 26 years old, her grandmother's eyes, her father's stubbornness, entirely her own everything else, and said, "Because I thought I was supposed to be okay." And Jenna reached across the table and took her mother's hand and said, "You are okay. You're also allowed to not be okay. Those aren't the same thing. They are not the same thing." That is the sentence at the center of everything this video has tried to say. You are okay, and you are also allowed to not be okay. And the distance between those two truths is where burnout lives and where recovery begins. Because burnout does not happen to people who did not try hard enough. It happens to people who tried too hard, for too long, without being given, or giving themselves, permission to stop. It happens to nurses who show up through hurricanes and divorces and grief Because showing up is what they know how to do and who they understand themselves to be. It happens to the parent who held the family together through a decade of difficulty and never once asked for help because asking felt like an admission of failure. It happens to the person watching this video right now who recognized themselves somewhere in Carol Merritt's story and felt, for the first time in a long time, that what they have been living inside has a name, and that the name is not weakness, and it is not laziness, and it is not a verdict on the kind of person they are. The name is burnout, and it is not the end of the story. It is the beginning of understanding it. If you recognized yourself in Carol's story, in the exhaustion that sleep cannot fix, in the tasks that have become impossible, in the numbness where feeling used to be, in the irritability that shames you, in the body that keeps breaking down in small, persistent ways, in the inability to rest, even when rest is available, please hear this. What you are experiencing is real. It is measurable. It is documented. And it is not evidence of what you lack. It is evidence of what you have been carrying, and for how long, and without enough support. You do not need to sit on the edge of a bed, unable to stand before you are allowed to take this seriously. You do not need to reach the point of collapse before you are allowed to say that something needs to change. The signs were there for Carol long before the Tuesday morning. The signs, if you are honest with yourself, have probably been there for you too. The question is not whether you can push through them. Of course you can. You have been pushing through them. The question is what it is costing you to keep pushing, and whether the person on the other side of that push is still going to be someone you recognize. Carol Merritt went back and planted her garden that spring. The tomatoes came in late but strong, the way they sometimes do after a difficult winter. She took photographs, the way she always used to. The seedlings, the first fruit, the harvest. She sent one to Diane Holloway, with a message that said only, "They made it." Diane wrote back, "So did you." Carol put her phone down and looked at the garden for a long time. The early morning quiet, the smell of the soil. Nashville waking up slowly around the edges of the backyard. She had not solved everything. There would be other hard stretches, other moments when the cave called to her, and the distance between where she was and where she needed to be felt impossible to cross. But she had something she had not had before the Tuesday morning. She had the language for it. She had the understanding that the wall was not made of weakness, and she had, for the first time in a very long time, the knowledge that on the other side of the wall was not a person who had failed, but a person who had carried too much, for too long, without being told that carrying had a limit, and that knowing the limit is not the end of strength. It is where real strength begins. Now we want to hear from you. Did you recognize yourself in any of the 6 signs Carol experienced? Have you ever pushed through exhaustion so long that your body finally made the decision for you? Or do you know someone who has? Drop your story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else watching right now needs to read today. And if this video opened something in you, if it named something you have been living inside without language for, share it with someone who needs to see it. Because there is a Carol Merritt in someone's life right now, sitting on the edge of a bed with one shoe on and one shoe off, and the people around her have no idea what is happening. Subscribe to this channel, because the mind never stops being worth understanding. And we will see you in the next one.